All right. So I'm going to talk to you today about big and labeled multidimensional arrays. And so the context, the sort of data that I work with, and sort of the problems are. So I work in industry at a company called the Climate Corporation. We help farmers make use of weather information to make better decisions. And so I work with a lot of different types of scientific data, and different sort of, and a lot of scientific data looks like, so it's data where you have, where you see physical simulations or a bunch of measurements, and it's sort of, it's complex data. There's a lot going on. The tools we have for working with that weren't that great. So that's kind of the sort of, I guess, the impetus for the work that I've done. So let me be a little more specific about the sort of the sort of data that I work with on a day-to-day basis, and maybe we'll see some similarities with sort of data that you're interested in, or the I think it's a little different from what people usually work with in sort of the data science industry. So we have, and I think I guess the first big difference is that we work with data that's it's like primarily it's numeric data. It has this multidimensional tensor structure to it. So for example, I'd like to use example that I work with. I work with a lot of weather forecasts, and weather forecasts are made on a grid, and they come out that you might say predict, say, surface air temperature over North America. And we make the weather forecasts, we'll make predictions for, say, today's weather and tomorrow's weather and the day after that, so in time. And we'll even work with, we'll add extra dimensions for things like keeping track of, I make a weather forecast today, and then I run the model again tomorrow and make a new weather forecast. So every day I have a new weather forecast. And then the weather forecasts aren't just, I don't just make one weather forecast. I actually run my weather forecast model maybe 10 or 50 times to get a range of the possibilities for what the weather could be. So for the weather next week in Berkeley, well, it's probably going to be sunny, but there might be. It's unlikely that you can't say with complete certainty what the weather forecasts are not very good at saying things with complete certainty when you look at next week or next month. So we look at ensembles as well, different scenarios. So we have, say, like big, say, 5-dimensional tensors of data that are, and so it's kind of awkward to work with just the 5-dimensional tensor, but the good news is there's a lot of labels and a lot of metadata associated with these data sets. So we have things, we know things like, we have like names associated, like we know that one of my axes for my array is going to be latitude or longitude or time. Each point is also identified by the coordinate labels as well. So like we have numbers associated with we have a date associated with every point along the time axis. We have say like a floating point number for every latitude and longitude. So there's a lot of metadata that can help us work with these tools. And there's also, I guess, lastly, the amount of data we work with ranges from sort of small data sets that they can pretty easily fit in memory to gigabytes or terabytes of data that require sort of new tools to work with that. So this is kind of the motivation. And I guess I would claim that this is actually not that different from a lot of scientific data sets. There's a lot of the data that we work with in the physical sciences comes on grids and across sort of all different sorts of domains. From neuroscience to sort of climate modeling to, say, physics, sort of experimental data. There's lots of very different types of sort of, I think a lot of the stuff we learn about how the world works, we collect it or we simulate it, and we do that on grids. And we do that with arrays. That's part of why in scientific computing we work so much. We use multidimensional arrays. And actually, a lot of the features which are sort of tricky with our data sets are also, I think, common with these data sets as well. I think every time someone writes data, almost every time someone's writing data down on a grid, there are actually a point in that grid has there's a lot of metadata associated with it. There's a lot of implicit information in terms of how we set up our problem that our tools really should be able to make use of. So sort of the framing problem for me is thinking a little more generally. I don't just want to make a tool that works well for, say, for weather forecasting. I mean, I could write a library that does say, crunches specifically weather forecast data. But that's not something that I think that there's a common thread here, and there's a need for tools in kind of like span disciplines. Sure, absolutely, if you have something quick, that's great. Yeah.
So it seems though this is on a regularly spaced grid, spatially.
Yes.
But probably not spectrally. So it sounds like, from my familiarity, that derives more from the measurement technique than from any modeling viewpoint that you're throwing on top of it.
Sure. So the regular spaced aspect for the grids is not necessary. I think that the aspect that you represent, if you're representing it as some sort of a grid, whether it's regularly or irregularly spaced, like something that I could write down in terms of as a matrix of numbers or like a multidimensional tensor of numbers with some set of consistent indices.
But not necessarily arbitrarily spaced.
It's true. So yeah. So you can't. So I think things get really hard if you try to talk about, say, like if I have some say a bunch of like point measurements, for example, and there are a lot of data sets that are like that. Sometimes, and like there are tools we can build for working with that, but that has not sort of been the focus here. I think those are often interesting problems. I think that oftentimes, I guess I would claim that sort of the unstructured problems have to some extent been solved, are more like what we see in terms of say the tools that are used in sort of, I guess, sort of traditional like data science tools for, say, with databases, or sort of the tools that have been built for processing sort of big data in sort of the commercial world, is that they deal with very unstructured data. And so I think the structured aspect, I think, is one of the big differences between, say, the data of sort of physical data science versus, like, I don't know, say, click data or advertising, sort of things like that. So the work I've done here has been in Python. And it's and sort of trying to fit in to the ecosystem of different libraries that people use for doing scientific programming in Python. In my view, one of the really awesome things about Python is that there's not one way to do it. There is this vibrant ecosystem, a bunch of different tools. Maybe, I mean, this is kind of a strength and a weakness in some extent. We don't necessarily know what the right tool is for every job. But there's some sort of core stack of tools that a lot of that people from many different disciplines kind of come together to work on, and these are sort of some of the core tools, and there are others as well, and this list is growing and shrinking. I'm going to suggest a couple of tools that I've worked on, which might make sense to possible additions to sort of add to this sort of SciPy stack. And each one of these tools does one of these things I've been talking about. So Xray is a library that I'm the main author of for doing sort of labeled multidimensional arrays. And this other library is that I want to talk about today is called Dask. Actually, Matthew Rockland, who's right here today in the audience, is the main author of Dask, but I've also made some contributions there. And that's a tool for working with larger data sets that don't fit into memory. So I think that these tools can possibly make could be valuable additions sort of to this core stack of tools we have for doing scientific computing in Python. Okay, so let me get started and start talking about more concretely about labeled arrays. Okay, I'm going to start by talking about DataFrames. And so DataFrames are DataFrames. This library Xray, its genesis comes from seeing how people work with tools like DataFrames and a Python library called Pandas for working with DataFrame. So DataFrame is really just it's sort of a mashup between somewhere halfway kind of between arrays and a relational database. It's a way of it's tabular data structure, so things like you would see, say, in a spreadsheet, but with an API that's sort of very usable for doing data analysis and for crunching numbers. And they work really well for when I think DataFrames work really well for, say, like human data or data that's not at all structured. So data where it's a bunch of records that fills out, and I can say I have some number of variables and a whole bunch of measurements, and there's not like some really obvious structure to it. DataFrames are a really great tool for that. And there is kind of a right way and a wrong way to do DataFrames. There's a notion of tidy data, and this is if you're so this comes from Hadley Wickham, who's the big contributor to the R world and like R DataFrames. And the right way to do DataFrames, sort of to make things sort of easy to analyze, is so we follow a couple simple rules. The first rule is that we make sure that each of the columns is a variable in our data set, so something that changes, and then each observation is a row. And if we follow these two simple rules, this is also sort of a standard way in which people will organize. There's a certain normal form for databases as well. I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's sort of a standard sort of concept, I guess, in the world of databases. That if we do this, we see we can make data. It can be organized in a way that makes it really easy to use sort of standard data analysis libraries, and we can we can make a whole tool suite for working with tidy data that works really well. So to give one concrete example, here I've organized some survey data about. This is taken from the Wickham's tidy data paper. Here's one version of it, and here's another sort of reformed version of the same data. Now this version here might be easier to read, like or print out, if I had to sort of like look at this on a sheet of paper. But for doing the data analysis tools, I want something that looks like this long version where every single row is extended out. So this is not what you want. This is not tidy data. And if you see, kind of the clue is when you see things like numbers in the column names. That's like a clue that you're not working with sort of the well-organized data. So what is Xray, and how does it build on these notions of data frames and tidy data? Well, so Xray is it's like a generalization of data frames, except where each of the columns can actually be some sort of multidimensional array. And the unifying characteristic here is that all these arrays, they might not all have the same dimensions. They might, for example, I have a pressure variable and I have an elevation variable and a latitude variable. Each of these has a 3D array or a 2D array or a 1D array, but they all live in the same coordinate system. So because they exist on the same coordinate system, they share the same coordinates. We can think about doing operations that we would perform on the shared set of arrays that act on the coordinate system. And it's also kind of a form of tidy data as well, because it's sort of, I like to think of it as sort of a multidimensional tidy data, because again, it's now very obvious that each of the let's say each of the column names should be a single variable, and that each observation here, the observations can have this multidimensional structure, but it's very clear that should be logically distinct from the column names as well. And so we have the shared coordinate system, and we have metadata here as well, that's implicit in this coordinate system. So we have things like this is the latitude axis, or the longitude axis, or the time axis. So we have labels corresponding to these the names of these dimensions, and we're also going to have labels corresponding to the points along the dimensions as well. So we're going to have both types of labels. And I'll show you an example of what would happen if you printed out this data. So you get a preview, and you see you see the names for each of these variables. You see the type of data they have. You see the first few values, and you see the coordinates along which they exist. So they all share the same length along the time, latitude, and longitude coordinates. Each of these coordinates has some size that is fixed across the entire data set, and the entire data set is referenced again across, say, the shared values of the time dimension or the latitude dimension. So this is what this basic data structure in Xray looks like. So what can we do with this, and why is this useful? And I think the first thing we can do with this is that we can start describing operations on our data set in terms of these labels instead of in terms of the arbitrary sort of numbers that we would use if we're using sort of traditional unlabeled arrays. So tools like NumPy, tools like MATLAB, tools like sort of all these scientific computing libraries and languages. So if we want to select out the data for January 1, and we want to take, say, the maximum along of this data for January 1, say the warmest station, let's say, on the particular day, with Xray, we can describe that using the metadata. So we say I'm going to access something along the time dimension or along the station dimension. I'm going to pull out, say, I'm going to provide a date that's going to select out one particular or some set of values along that dimension, and I can write something that's going to I can write code that directly reflects my intent, and that directly maps my that doesn't need any explanation. So I can write this, and it's almost entirely clear what this means, even if you don't. I mean, you have to guess. Oh, cell is short for select, but like the intent of this code is sort of very obvious. The intent of the version with just the numbers is much less clear, and that's because I've had some arbitrary numbers here, like axis 2, or like this, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 0 through 3. So you wouldn't really write code like this, hopefully. Maybe you would if you're doing some quick little one-off analysis, but like hopefully if you're doing it right, this code would actually be expanded. It would be something. Oops. It would be. You'd probably write like 3 lines with some comments, or maybe you'll define some variable names. Maybe you will save some separate data structure that like keeps track of that maps from, say, the dimension names to the axis numbers. You wouldn't, if you're writing something like this, if you want to be able to sort of come back to it and know that it works properly, to do this right, it's a lot more work. So it's great to have tools that sort of directly make use of the metadata. I think that's the first thing. That's like the biggest thing about why I think Xray is a useful tool. There are also some nice tricks we can do with this metadata that provide sort of additional incentives for using the metadata, and that give us additional things we can do with it as well. So one example is vectorization. So for those of you who are, I expect most of you are familiar with saying a tool like NumPy or MATLAB. If I can add together a scalar number and a vector and get back a vector. Or I can maybe add together a vector and a matrix, and if I do it right, I'll get back another matrix. So I have operations where I sort of can do an implicit loop based on the dimensions, based on the arguments. So when we have dimension names, we can actually do even better than that. We can match things up based on the names, not just their order. And so let me show you an example. Let's suppose I have 2 one-dimensional arrays. I have one array along time and one array along space. If I add these together, I don't want to like create some sort of hybrid space-time dimension. That would not be very useful. So I could maybe give an error message. That would be one option. But we can also, there's actually a useful thing you can do with that, and that is say like, well, when I add time and space, maybe I really want something that has both dimensions. So the full set of that's going to be aligned along the full set of dimensions. So we can set up this in NumPy is called broadcasting. We can make broadcasting work with the names of dimensions. And that also, so that's useful for things like this. It's also useful for things like, if I happen to have my matrix and I have my matrix transposed, I can still add together my matrix and its transpose and get back something that has sort of sensible dimensions. Yeah?
In the first case, what are the values? The dimensions are clear, but what do you actually have in cell 2, 3?
Yes, so what would happen here, that's a great, what are the values in these arrays? So what would happen is that if I have, maybe I should probably annotate this example actually. If I have A1, A2, A3, and B1, B2, B3, the first element here is A1 plus B1. The second element is still A1 plus B2. It's the indices here. If a cell in here corresponds to one time and one space, to find out what values go in that cell, I would need to refer back. I'd refer back to the corresponding elements of the original arrays. So by their labels. So this sort of thing works. Does that kind of answer your question?
If one is 1 and the other is 3, is the value 4, or is the value 1 and 3 together?
Okay. So here I'm literally, depends on what the operation you're doing. That's a great question. Here, if I'm literally doing a plus operation, they would be added together. If I was doing a times operation, they would be multiplied.
Okay, so you would get 4.
I would get 4 in this case. Exactly, 1, 3 would give me 4.
So you
Yeah.
look at this as kind of generalized recycle. You take
Yeah, so I'm recycling the points. And one neat trick about how the tools like NumPy work is that they can do this. So the design of a tool like NumPy actually works is that you can actually do all this recycling basically for free. I only have to create the 2D array. It's like this large once. I don't have to copy these arrays in memory. That's sort of a neat trick of the way that say the strided n-dimensional array model works. So it's a pretty cheap operation. We can do this vectorization almost for free in some sense. It's not any more expensive than it's something we can do very efficiently. And the case where this comes in really handy is basically I don't have to worry about the especially say if I'm working with something that has more than 2 dimensions. If I have 3 or 4 or 5 dimensions for my array, there is a 0% chance that I will correctly guess what the order of those dimensions are. It's like some mix of dimensions, and I have to think really carefully and look through my code to figure out how it works. I've written a lot of stuff without dimension names where you have a mess of code where you're like, okay, let's try transposing that array. Maybe it'll add together. Let's try adding in a new axis. Let's try and that stuff is just you spend it's not that much time, but it's a source of annoyance, and it's a source of you have a really hard time keeping track of. There's a lot of noise in your code basically. So the labels make that better.
How is precedence for the resulting dimension ordering chosen?
Yep. So the order of the resulting dimensions is in order of appearance from the arguments, from sort of left to right. So there's an order for the dimensions in the first argument, and then an order in the second argument, and then here, if it's time space, then we'll do time space. If I was adding in another array that had some other dimension here, like time space, and I'm not even sure what goes beyond time and space, but so something. Let's say we're going into some fractal dimension or something. Anyways, that would be an extra one at the end. So that's vectorizing by dimension names. That's one trick we can do with labels. Another trick we do with labels, this is making a different aspect of the labels, is that once we know what the dimensions are, we also have labels along each dimension. So every cell has given some label, and here I'm using letters. But what might happen is that I might have 2 arrays, and they might have different labels actually with them. So I might have you could have a case where I have one has the labels A through G, another has, say, a different size, has labels D through I. When I get in a situation like this, we certainly don't want to try to the approach with a tool there are a couple things we do. One thing we could do is we could say if the labels don't exactly match up, then we'll just give an error and we'll stop. That's a perfectly sensible thing to do. But another neat thing we can do is we can actually still make this work even in a useful way by saying that if the labels don't quite match up, then what I want to do is I want a result that has the aligned labels. So I want to line up the arguments based on the labels, and I want a result that is defined on say the intersection of the labels from the arguments. So that's something we can do with this is something we've borrowed from the pandas library for working with the labels. And this is another operation that actually we can do pretty efficiently because pandas can very efficiently calculate, say, the intersection of 2 sets using hash tables. So not too much overhead, and we can make this alignment stuff work as well. So those are a couple of things we can do with this stuff. Maybe I'll mention a few other sorts of operations that sort of make sense, sort of generalizing things from taking things from the world of data frames and databases to sort of arrays. And I think the biggest operation, the sort of most common one of the most common analysis tricks that people do is is a grouped operations. So things like I have somehow, let's say for example, I have some data set maybe defined on a big grid. Say it's over the United States, and I have 50 states. And now I want to calculate. I want to calculate, say the average elevation by state, for example. And these sort of operations also make sense on multidimensional arrays, and we can define things like this with Xray. We can do things like we have the labels. That means you can just plot something. You don't have to you don't have to fill that in later. So like that's really convenient from a data analysis perspective. And I think this actually has so I think this is pretty important, and maybe it seems a little trivial, but the metadata makes it easy to compute some of this stuff, and like that's great. That's a nice incentive for doing the data analysis. But the other aspect is that we know metadata is important, but unless it does something for us, we don't. It's hard to actually use it. So I think another really important point from the perspective of reproducibility in science is that we know that metadata is good, and that our analysis should sort of preserve the metadata, use the metadata, sort of check that it's all there. But unless you're being super careful about it, and unless you have the right data structures, it's such a pain to actually keep around the metadata that they're not going to bother, or you're only going to bother for something that's really important, and that means that in many cases you lose that metadata. And that's something that makes stuff harder to that makes things sort of harder to reproduce, harder to understand. So I think the metadata is really important, and I think things like the plotting are actually a great example of I mean, the main reason, half the reason for plotting is not so much because, I mean, it's nice to be able to make a plot easily, but just as importantly, like the best way to get someone to fix the name to like fill in the name of a variable, or to ensure that it's longitude, not just like dimension 0, is to show them a plot that's labeled by like dimension 0. They're going to immediately go back and fix their data structure, keep that metadata maintained, make it look right. So having the data structures that use the metadata and do things with it is a great way to encourage people to use it. That's the carrot as opposed to the stick of metadata. Okay, so that's my intro to Xray. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about dask and what we can do with dask for sort of another approach to working with arrays. So dask. So again, I'll talk a little bit about the ideas behind dask, and then I'll show you a quick demo of what dask can do. So dask is a tool that tries to extend these scientific computing tools in Python, like NumPy and Pandas, to working with sort of medium-sized data sets. So I guess I kind of lied when I said big data, but big data is sexy, so hopefully you'll forgive me. The reality is that most of the world doesn't really have big data where you really need a supercomputer or a giant cluster of machines to access. For a lot of data, there's a lot of data that falls in this range of, say, 10 gigabytes to 10 terabytes, which is pretty awkward to fit on, you can't fit into memory on your machine, but you can fit it on your hard drive, and you don't necessarily need a truly gigantic scale sort of supercomputing solution. You actually be like maybe a single machine or small cluster machines can get you a huge amount of bang for your buck. So dask tries to solve this problem first before trying to solve like the really big data problem. It does this there are sort of two things it does. The first thing it does is that it lets you use your multiple cores on your machine. So these days, even my laptop has 4 cores, but many of these traditional scientific computing libraries only can use 1 core at a time. So dask lets you do that, and it also lets you do things that are bigger than fit into memory. So it can do streaming computation that you can't necessarily even if I can't load the entire data set in memory at once. And the other part that I really like, that was really impressed me about dask, is that it has a very simple data model. It has a simple, hopefully I'll show you in a few minutes here what that looks like, and a simple approach. It's kind of it kind of starts very naturally where tools like NumPy leave off on a single machine, and it very naturally generalizes that in a way that's not immediately trying to solve, say, like really hard problems that sort of massively distributed systems. It's sort of slightly distributed, and then hopefully maybe a little more distributed. And so the tools that will, so starting simple with a sort of transparent model that you can understand from, and starting on one machine, I think is great. And again, my disclaimer, dask is not my project. This is all these good ideas here. Those are really Matthew's, who's sitting over here in the audience, who is the author of dask. I just think it's a really awesome tool, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about it. And it's something that we've integrated into Xray because it helps us solve problems that we couldn't do otherwise. Okay. Well, I've made some contributions to Dask.array. Yes. So let me talk a little bit about the bigger picture for Dask. So Dask has a very has a clean separation between an idea of a collection, which would be like a data structure that someone would work with, like an array or a data frame, and then an abstract representation of how these computations are represented in terms of different tasks, in terms of a graph of tasks. And then there's a matter of how they're actually evaluated in terms of different schedulers. And I think the focus so far has mostly been on multi-threaded or multi-processing schedulers, which run in a single machine. And those actually work very well. They let you do a lot of neat stuff. There's also a hope that eventually we'll have a distributed scheduler. I know that's what Matthew's been working on over the past few months, so that we can scale this up to like clusters as well. And then we can start solving problems that look sort of more similar to what things people would do using more sort of big data tools like Spark, for example. So let me talk. I want to talk about the Dask array in particular, because that's the tool I'm familiar with, and the tool that I think and that works really well with tools like Xray. So a Dask array it's a data structure where you built out of chunks, so tasks defined on chunks. So like many of these sort of distributed array systems, a Dask array, if I have a big block and I divide it in, and I'm going to define how things work on individual pieces of the array, and then I know how I'm going to how I can fit them all together later to so at any given point in time, a Dask array is defined by a knowledge of what these chunks are and a knowledge of, say, how to create a new chunk out of an old chunk. And that's represented just in terms of the tasks are represented in terms of dictionaries in Python that are defining, say, element 0, 0. The X array is based on you pull it out of the Y array and you add 1. And these are operations that are defined on top of NumPy arrays. So it builds on top of these on top of tools like NumPy that work very well for handling, say, a block of data in memory. And then I'm just going to, and if NumPy can handle, say, 1,000 by 1,000 matrix, with like 1 million elements pretty well, I'm just going to define things in terms of operations that are defined in terms of a whole bunch of little things I'm going to do on arrays of 1 million elements. And then it's just a matter of putting them all together and figuring out how to actually execute these tasks. So with that, I'm going to show you a little demo. Of things you can do with what you can do with Dask. And here I'm going to borrow. This is again inspired by something that let's do this full screen and see if that is a readable size on the screen here. Awesome. Okay, so I have. Let me just restart this. So I have a notebook here where I'm going to show you what a Dask array looks like. So Dask has an API design that is almost exactly like NumPy. If you're familiar with NumPy, the only difference is that when I create an array, so if I create a 5 by 5 array of ones, in this case there's also this chunks argument, which says that I'm going to divide it into blocks of size 3. So there are 3 elements in each chunk. So it's actually going to be 2 by 2 chunks. And it doesn't actually, nothing exists here until I compute it. So if I compute the array, I see it's a 5 by 5 array of chunks. But until then, it's just a bunch of chunks that are it's a sort of an abstract computation that's like sitting in, that's just defined in a very abstract way. So the things we can do, so we can also, because we have this representation with of this array in terms of tasks, we can inspect the tasks and we can do things like visualize the graph of tasks. So I'm going to show. So this is I guess the very simple example here of right now. This doesn't look very interesting. Right now I have 4 blocks and they're just sitting there basically. But I'll show you a little bit. I'll show you what we can sort of build up here out of these. What we can build up out of these smaller pieces with the with Dask. So I'm going to start simple. I'm going to add 1 to the array, and we see that we still have 4 blocks for the array, and they just kind of get they add 1 task. I'm going to do something. I'm going to take the average of the array, now you can see that these blocks, okay, it's a little hard the scrolling is not working great here, but there we go. You can see we're putting together all these different tasks. We're taking the average of each little chunk, and now we're going to aggregate them all together. And we can even do some really complex stuff, which works remarkably well. So for example, if I'm going to say add 1 to x, I could, well, a transpose doesn't really do anything, but maybe I'll do a dot product. And oh my, that gets a lot more complicated. So we have this, so because of how the sort of the flexible model that the dask has in terms of sort of creating these tasks and dictionaries, it can represent really sort of pretty complex operations that could be a lot that would be a lot harder to do, for example, in terms of, say, like the map reduce paradigm, for example. And we can sort of continue to imagine putting together tasks like this plus x. We can take some averages. We can build these sort of towers of tasks, and then eventually, now that I have this representation here of doing a few simple array manipulations, later we can come through with a scheduler and execute each of these. We can execute each of these little blocks. So this is so as an example of sort of the complex things you can do with this. So one of the contributors to dask, this was I'm forgetting his name, but it's sort of a machine learning researcher wrote some linear algebra routines that built on top of dask. So that can let you do things like, so this is the graph representing a QR decomposition, which we can visualize, so we can really, it's also, so this gives us a sense of sort of how the data flows through our algorithms, even in these sort of fairly complex sorts of situations. And again, because we have these task graphs, we can also, we can do things that, say, plug into the, we can also plug into the execution engine, and we can see things like, for example, we can, we'll see here, we can profile the task. So for example, this task is going to takes a minute to complete. Well, but and you can actually see how much time it spent doing each individual chunk of that giant computation. So for each piece, we can have some interactive graph that will show us, say, like what the time spent doing different types of computation. So that's kind of a bit of a sort of the architecture of dask. I guess I'm close to running out of time, so I will show you a little bit about. I'll just say that this is a tool that I like dask because it has a sort of a simple, understandable abstraction. And it's something that we were able to really easily hook into Xray and lets us do really awesome things with the scientific data that we work with. So for example, I'll just show you really quickly here. Not really have time to go into it, but here I have an example where I have data that is maybe it's only in this case it's only 5.5 gigabytes on disk, but by the time if I open up a whole bunch of this weather data in the form of these NetCDF files, it actually in memory it's a lot more data. It's actually I can plot it out. It's a bunch of weather data at different times. In memory, it turns out it would be something like 23 gigabytes loaded into memory, which is more memory than I have on my laptop. But I can do I can easily set up computations here, which will ensure they're a little bit slower. It might take me 30 seconds to sort of go through my array and compute the mean. But that's just the price of loading data from disk. And it's awesome that we have tools that can do that. And it integrates really nicely. So Xray can, so the computation in Xray will do things like building these task graphs. It will, if you compute, because we only define things on like little pieces of the array, I can compute something on, I can really quickly say, if I'm converting, say, do some like scalar arithmetic to convert from Kelvin to degrees Fahrenheit, I can see a little preview of what the result looks like before it's without having to compute the entire array, because it only needs to compute one little block. And then we can sort of hook into tools like again the sort of execution engine of dask to do things like add profiling, for example, or to see a progress bar that shows us how long it takes to execute each task. or do things like to cache execution, so we don't have to calculate the same values twice. And if you compute things, we see we build these task graphs, and we can really see what goes into our computation and how we would and how we're going to execute it. Okay. So that's a bit of a preview of Xray and Dask. Let me go back and sort of talk a little bit more about, in the last few minutes here, talk about the some of the opportunities, I think, in sort of like the bigger picture in terms of sort of areas that I'm excited about in the future of tools like Xray and Dask, and sort of the broader sort of scientific computing array ecosystem. So Dask works very well for what it does. There are some things that it struggles to optimize that are sort of based because of the data model that it has. And I think an example would be figuring out the right way to divide up your data into little chunks is something that's a tool like Dask is really not suited for. You really need something that sort of keeps track of what your entire computation is. Can then maybe go back in and say, given your computer architecture, here's how much data you can store in memory. Here's how you're going to use it. Here's what the right side of the chunk should be. In practice, that might make a large difference. Things like avoiding unnecessary reading of data from disk. So maybe I don't want to read an entire block of data. Maybe when I compute, say, like a sign function on the first 10 elements, I want to do the indexing operation first, and then I want to compute the sign function. And these are things that we can do that in principle, if you know what the computation is, you can do automatically. And some of these things we can do in Dask, but some of them are hard, especially things like if I want to add two things together. Again, I want to pull out the data first before I add them together. And these things can be hard to make work with some of the tools we have. Another example would be, again, if you have an abstract representation of the computation, you can often optimize it and speed it up as well. And you can do neat tricks like in a tool like NumPy, when I add together three arrays, I create a lot of intermediate. I create an intermediate result that has a lot of extra data. And in reality, I could, if you know it is ahead of time, you can do the computation much faster without any temporary results. And so that would be like fusing operations. And this is possible, especially with things like just-in-time compilers. So a tool like for example, there are some examples of tools that can do things like this, like Theano or Numba. So maybe there's another room for another project for lazy array optimizations. And I'll mention there are a few projects that have kind of going in that direction that I'd really like to see sort of improved upon and try to build as a tool that lives on top of Dask. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. So if I have an operation that does x plus 1, that uses like two different, say does the same operation but not the same variable. I think that's another example of something where I think with the way that Dask, Matthew correct me on this, but I'm pretty sure I think that currently the way Dask works, that it probably would execute both of those separately. Okay, so if we're lucky, it will. Hopefully it'll all be the same key, and you won't have to compute it twice. That'd be another. But that's another thing that you might imagine adding in some like higher layer on top to notice that stuff. And some of these tricks that Dask already does a reasonable job of. But I think that there's some room here for sort of building on top of this, and something that could be used by other projects as well. The other thing, coming back to Xray, Xray is something kind of like there's a lot going on. I think it's really powerful, but it's really almost like an in-memory array database with these labels and these multiple arrays that all in the same coordinate system. And for a lot of use cases, that's really overkill. That's not what we. That's more than what we really want or what we need to deal with. So and particularly for tools like, say, scikit-learn is a machine learning library in Python, they really would love to be able to keep track of they just want to know if my matrix has samples or features versus samples, or if my array is samples or if it's features, and like there's a lot of bookkeeping to keep track of this stuff. And something simpler might meet those needs without being as complicated as Xray. So maybe something simpler than Xray. Maybe there's a way we could put these labels closer into a tool like NumPy, a simpler version of this. And this is something people have talked about for some time. Yeah? So yes, so Xray does. So in-memory is maybe not quite the right word. So Xray absolutely can execute computations on top of dask, and you could, in principle, even put Xray objects inside dask. In some cases, that might make sense. So it does do out of memory stuff as well, but it doesn't do. But again, it's with this sort of complex data model. And I guess the last thing I'm going to probably end here before because I'm. Without going into sort of too many details as well, but there's a lot of really cool tools for working with arrays. And I told you today about a couple of them that I've worked on. I told you about Xray and dask, and these build upon tools like build upon NumPy, for example. But there's a whole bunch of different tools that fit together. That meet all these needs for doing things like in-memory arrays or parallel arrays, different ways I want to memorize something, say a sparse array or a compressed array, or different types of labeled arrays, different types of arrays with units, different types of parallel sort of distributed backends. Maybe I want to do it using like the dask approach. Maybe I want to like scale it up. I want to do it on like a tool like Spark, for example. That's what Bolt does. Then there's like a million domain-specific libraries as well. So how can we make it so that we can mix and match these different tools together? So that scientists can pick the right tool and they're not locked into, say, we don't have to have like, every astronomer uses like the exact same set of underlying libraries that has been standardized on. How can we make this easier to sort of compose these operations? I think it's a really important problem. I won't tell you, I have some ideas about how we can fix that in NumPy. I'm not going to go through this today. But I will say, yeah, so there's a lot of different types of data. I guess I don't really have time to go into this. But all right, so maybe I'll leave it here. I think we can do really awesome science if we have better array structures. We can do it faster. We can do it more reliably, more reproducible. So let's build some awesome new data structures. Yeah. Sure. So rank statistics are hard to do with distributed with out of core data.